They doubted the woman because of her badge and skin color, but they didn't know who was standing in front of them. Look how one revelation changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun stood high over Red Hollow, pouring its unblinking heat down on the one dusty road that cut through the middle of the settlement. It was the kind of day when the air itself shimmered and the horizon swayed like the surface of a mirage. Horses stood tethered in the thin shade of warped posts, heads lowered, tails swishing at lazy flies. From the open doors of the saloon came the faint jingle of glasses and the drone of a piano that sounded like it had been tuned a lifetime ago. But all of that background life dimmed under the slow, deliberate pace of the funeral procession, making its way toward the small cemetery beyond the outskirts. At the center of it all, 6 men bore the plain, wooden coffin of Sheriff Tom Harper on their shoulders. The box creaked faintly under its weight, though the men carrying it did not falter, their boots thudding in uneven rhythm against the hardened dirt. Behind them came the widowed wife, Evelyn Harper, dressed in black from her narrow-brimmed hat down to the hem of her long skirt, which trailed in the dust and picked up the same brown as the road. She was young still, 32, but the days of grief that had passed since her husband's death had already carved fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Her hair, as dark as the ravens that sometimes circled above the mesas, was bound at the back of her head. In her right hand she carried no flowers, no book of prayers, only the silver star of the sheriff, polished so clean that the midday light leapt from its surface in sharp glints. On the back of that badge, a man's hand, her husband's, had once pressed the words, "Justice stands tall," letter by letter into the metal. The people of Red Hollow followed, some close behind, others trailing at a distance. There were women with baskets hooked over their arms, men in worn coats who kept their hats pressed to their chests, and children who did not quite understand why everyone spoke in hushed voices. Some of the faces in that slow crowd held genuine sorrow. Others wore a kind of tight reserve, as though they were there not for the man in the box, but for the spectacle. Not everyone in town had approved when Tom Harper had married a woman with Navajo blood. Even fewer knew what to make of the fact that she had been his right hand in more ways than one, helping him with ledgers, prisoners, and the occasional disputes that broke out on the street. The cemetery was little more than a rise of earth ringed by a crude fence, its gate half off its hinges. Wooden crosses stood among the dry tufts of grass, some leaning at weary angles, some already bare of the names that had been carved into them. The coffin was set down by the family plot, the men straightening their backs and stepping away. Evelyn stood at the head of it, her fingers tightening on the badge as the preacher's voice carried over the stillness. The words rolled past her without catching. She could hear only the steady push of her own breath and the faint rustle of fabric from the onlookers shifting their weight. When it was over and the coffin lowered into the ground, she lingered longer than the others. People drifted away in twos and threes, the hum of their muted conversations following them back toward the main street. She remained until the last clump of dirt had been thrown down, until the raw earth lay mounded where her husband now rested. Only then did she turn, moving down the path with the badge clutched firmly in her hand, its weight both a comfort and a burden. The house she returned to was silent in that heavy way that made every creak of the floorboards sound louder. Tom's coat still hung on the peg by the door. The rifle he'd cleaned religiously leaned in its place near the hearth. On the table lay a newspaper from 2 days before, folded open to an article about a cattle auction he had never gotten to read. A kerosene lamp stood in the corner, the glass chimney smudged faintly from smoke. She placed the badge down on the table, and for a moment the sun through the window caught it, casting a star-shaped patch of light across the wood. The grief was a steady presence in her chest, a weight that did not shift no matter how she moved. But beneath it ran something harder, something that had always been there even before she married Tom. A knowledge of how quickly the world could take from you, and how much strength it took to keep what was yours. She walked to the small basin, washed her hands and face, and studied her reflection in the piece of mirror nailed to the wall. The eyes that looked back were steady. That afternoon, a messenger came from the council. They were gathering in the sheriff's office, and they wanted her to attend. She left the house with her hat drawn low and the badge in her pocket, the sun pressing down on her shoulders as she crossed the street. The building was small, the front room dominated by a desk scarred with years of use, a map of the territory on the wall, and the faint smell of gun oil lingering in the air. Inside, the councilmen sat around a table, each looking more uncomfortable than the last. They were practical men merchants, a blacksmith, the owner of the saloon, a rancher. They spoke of the weeks ahead, of the fact that Red Hollow needed someone to wear the star until a new sheriff could be elected. The nearest territorial marshal was 2 weeks' ride away, and they could not afford to leave the position vacant. She listened without speaking, watching the play of expressions on their faces, some wary, some outright skeptical, and one or two that carried a grudging respect. The decision came slowly, with mutters and exchanges of glances, but it came all the same. Until the election, Evelyn Harper would serve as acting sheriff. She accepted without flourish, only a quiet nod, and fastened the badge to her coat before leaving. Outside, she could feel the eyes of passers-by following her, some curious, some disapproving. Her first hours in the role were a quiet testing of boundaries. She walked through the office, noting the stacks of old case files, the sealed evidence packets, the unclaimed letters. The Colt her husband had kept in his desk lay clean and loaded, its grips worn smooth by his hand. She took the belt and adjusted it to fit her, the metal of the buckle cool against her fingers. By evening, she had already handled small matters: a dispute over a missing mule, a complaint about noise from the saloon, a merchant claiming short weights in his scales. She dealt with each in the same measured way Tom had taught her: listen, decide, enforce, showing neither favoritism nor weakness. A drunk in the livery stable tested her once, stepping too close with the stale smell of whiskey on his breath. Without raising her voice, she took his arm in a grip that brooked no argument and guided him to sit until he sobered. When the day was nearly done, she returned to find a knife embedded in the wooden doorframe, a crude drawing of a star scratched into a piece of paper pinned beneath it. She pulled it free and slid both blade and paper into a drawer for safekeeping. There were those who would not take kindly to her wearing the badge, and they had wasted no time in showing it. Beyond the town's edge, the land sloped upward to the low hills. Near the road that led out toward the mining claims, she could just make out a wagon with the name of Silas Broderick's company painted along the side. Two figures stood near it, watching in the fading light, before turning their horses and disappearing over the rise. Broderick's operation had been the subject of whispers for months. Debts worked off in chains, night shifts that left men broken, records that never matched. She had not yet seen enough to act, but she kept the knowledge close, a stone in her pocket. That night, alone in the office, she set the badge on the desk beside the revolver. The lamplight made the silver gleam, throwing its shadow long across the papers. Outside, the street lay quiet under the stars, but she knew that quiet was a thin crust over deeper trouble. The badge was not just a memory of Tom now. It was a promise, one she intended to keep, no matter who thought she had no right to it. The morning light in Red Hollow came pale and flat, seeping over the hills without much warmth. A thin haze hung over the town, stirred now and then by a fitful breeze that carried the smell of dust and horse sweat. Evelyn had been at the desk since before dawn, her fingers smudged with pencil lead from sorting through Tom's old notes and half-finished reports. Outside the window, the street was slow to wake, but she had already learned that trouble did not keep the same hours as decent folk. It could arrive in the quietest moment, unannounced. By mid-morning, a low murmur passed through the air, like the first roll of distant thunder. She looked up from her work to see 3 riders making their way down the main street. They moved at an unhurried pace, the kind of slow swagger that was more statement than necessity, their horses lifting their legs high and deliberate through the dust. Each man wore a long, weathered coat the color of old bone, hats pulled low enough to shadow their eyes. They were strangers, and strangers always drew notice here. The first was broad across the shoulders, his coat open to show the gleam of a revolver on each hip, grips darkened from use. The second carried himself with a looser gait, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his Colt, as if it was an afterthought. Slung across his saddle, half hidden under the flap of his coat, was the shortened barrel of a scattergun, a weapon built for close and sudden work. The third was leaner, his face pale under the brim of his hat, but his eyes swept the buildings with the same calculating rhythm as the others. They did not speak to anyone at first, only let their gazes roam over the layout of the street, pausing on the sheriff's office long enough for Evelyn to notice. Then without hurry, they guided their horses to the saloon, tethered them loosely to the rail, and disappeared inside. She could not hear their voices from where she sat, but she could imagine the pattern, the ordering of whiskey, the long moments of silent watching, the weighing of the room. Men like that did not arrive in town without a purpose. The day wore on with an uneasy undercurrent. Word drifted in on the casual talk of merchants and loafers that the trio had been asking questions. Who ran the law in town now? How long she'd been wearing the badge? Whether she had anyone to back her up. The questions were posed lightly, but the intent behind them was anything but casual. She heard from the blacksmith, Luis, that one of them had made a joke loud enough for the bar to hear about how quick a squaw sheriff might drop the star when things got hot. Others repeated it with the sort of laugh that wasn't truly amused. Evelyn kept her patrol as usual, crossing the street to check on the livery, walking the length of the boardwalk to the general store. She could feel eyes on her more than once, the weight of a gaze that lingered just a fraction too long. Each time when she turned, there was nothing but a shifting curtain in a saloon window or the tail of a coat disappearing around a corner. Near sundown, she caught sight of them again, this time at the far end of town. They were speaking with a man she recognized as one of Silas Broderick's foremen, a thick-necked brute with arms like the beams in the mine supports. The meeting was brief, ending with the foreman passing a small, worn leather satchel to the tallest of the strangers. No handshake, no words she could hear, just a shared glance before they parted ways. The three riders walked their horses back toward the saloon, and the foreman turned his own mount toward the road that led to the mining camps. That night she sat alone in the office, the lamplight catching motes of dust as they drifted through the air. She thought about the rumors that had been building for months about men disappearing from the camps, about debts that could never be repaid, about the muffled cries some swore they heard on the wind at night. Broderick's mine was a place where the law was invited only on the owner's terms, and those terms never included open doors. Tom had spoken of wanting to investigate, but other matters had always pulled him away. Now the decision to act or to wait rested with her alone. The next morning she rode out to the edge of the mining property. The gate stood open in a way that looked inviting at first glance, but the air was heavy with the smell of sweat and metal, and the men who worked there moved with a stiffness that was not just from hard labor. A quick survey told her more than the foreman would ever admit. The barracks were overfull, the equipment worn but not replaced, and at the base of the main building, she saw the telltale scuff marks of chains against wood posts. The foreman appeared as she dismounted, his expression neutral in that way, meant to hide hostility. She stated her intent to conduct an inspection, and though his words were polite enough, his eyes gave away the calculation behind them. He walked her through the main yard, keeping the tour tight and swift, steering her away from the low outbuilding near the ridge. But she noticed the second set of books in the office. The ledgers with pages missing, the neat rows of names without surnames. She left without pressing further, knowing that a premature move could close doors for good. Back in town, she sent a telegraph to the district judge requesting an official order for inspection. Until it arrived, all she could do was watch and wait. The days that followed brought a subtle escalation. One evening, as she returned home, a rifle shot cracked through the air, striking the edge of her shutter and splintering the wood. The street had been empty, the source unseen. The next morning, she found a dead coyote left on her porch, its pelt stiff and eyes glassy. At the office, a rough charcoal drawing of her, with the badge crossed out in an X, had been tacked to the door. Still, she made her rounds, spoke with the townsfolk who were willing to meet her gaze, and built her alliances. Luis, the blacksmith, began spending more time near the office in the evenings, his bulk a quiet deterrent. Anna, the schoolteacher, offered her ear for the concerns of the women in town, bringing her scraps of information overheard from husbands who spoke too freely. The telegraph operator, a wiry man with a sharp mind, promised to keep her messages moving quickly. And then there was Caleb O'Rourke, the old cavalryman who had ridden with Tom in younger days. He stopped by one afternoon to sit in the chair opposite her desk, saying little but leaving her with the sense that, when the moment came, he would be there. The order from the judge arrived 5 days later, sealed and signed, granting her authority to inspect the mine and seize any evidence of unlawful confinement. She folded the paper and tucked it inside her coat, close to the badge. It was that very afternoon she noticed the three strangers watching her again. This time they did not try to hide it. They stood together outside the saloon, leaning against the rail, eyes following her as she crossed the street. One tipped his hat in a mockery of courtesy, and another smiled in a way that was nothing like kindness. She knew then they would not wait for her to act. Whatever they had been sent to do, they meant to do it soon, and they wanted everyone in Red Hollow to see. The breeze shifted, carrying with it the smell of rain from far off in the desert. But here the air stayed dry and tense. Evelyn walked on, every step measured, every sense alert. The town might have been going about its business, merchants calling prices, children chasing a hoop down the boardwalk, but she could feel it, the stillness before the storm. And in that stillness, the ghosts of enemies she had yet to face were already moving closer. The heat settled over Red Hollow like a heavy blanket by the time the sun reached its peak. The sky above was a hard, cloudless blue, and the boards of the main street's walkways had been warmed enough to make the air shimmer above them. A few wagons rolled slowly through the dust, their wheels grinding over the hard-packed road, while horses stood tethered at the rails outside shops and saloons. Heads bowed in resignation to the day. The smell of hay, horseflesh, and old whiskey hung faintly in the air. It might have been any other midday in the small town, except for the quiet that seemed to rest over everything. A quiet born not of peace but of expectation. Evelyn stepped out of the sheriff's office into that heat, adjusting the brim of her hat against the sun. The silver badge caught the light where it rested against her coat, its gleam a small, sharp defiance against the muted browns and grays of the street. She had already walked the length of town once that morning, stopping to check on the livery, exchanging brief nods with merchants, letting people see her in the role that so many still doubted she had the right to fill. Now she crossed the street toward the general store, her steps measured and steady, the weight of the revolver at her hip a familiar presence. She saw them before she heard them. The three strangers had been leaning near the watering trough outside the saloon, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. As she approached the center of the street, they broke apart like wolves closing in on prey. One moved to her left, another to her right, and the third stepped into her path, forcing her to slow. There was nothing hurried in their movements. The menace lay in the precision, in the way they took up the space around her, without so much as glancing at one another. The man who stepped in front of her was the tallest, the broad-shouldered one who wore his revolvers low on his hips. His hand rested casually on the grip of one, the sun flashing off the worn metal as his fingers curled there. To her right, the leaner man had shifted his coat aside to free the shortened barrel of his scattergun. On her left, the one with the easy swagger reached out without warning, closing his rough hand around her forearm. The grip was firm, the kind of hold meant to show possession. She stopped moving, feeling the circle of them tighten. The man in front took a half-step closer, closing the space between them until she could see the faint sheen of sweat along his hairline. His other hand rose, not in greeting, but to tug the brim of her hat back enough that her eyes met his. The look there was not curious. It was the measuring stare of someone who had already decided what they thought of her. Around them, the street had gone still. A woman carrying a basket of laundry froze on the steps of the boarding house, eyes wide. Two men standing outside the barber's leaned back against the wall, their conversation drying up mid-sentence. A group of children paused in their game, their hoop rolling slowly to a stop against the boardwalk. The town was watching, but no one stepped forward. The man to her left shifted his weight and reached for the badge on her coat. His fingers caught the edge of it, tugging hard enough to pull the fabric taut. He held it there a moment, as though weighing whether to rip it free and toss it into the dust at their feet. The tall one in front moved his thumb over the hammer of his revolver, the motion deliberate and slow, the metal clicking faintly under the sound of her steady breathing. Evelyn stood straight, shoulders square, her gaze fixed not on any one of them, but slightly above, as if she could see past their circle to a place beyond the heat and the dust and the narrow street. She didn't shift her feet or strain against the hand holding her arm. The badge remained where it was, though she could feel the pressure of fingers still hooked on it, testing the resistance. From somewhere to her right, the shortened scattergun came into view, the barrel angling upward until it pointed at her head. The man holding it had a faint smile, the kind that didn't touch his eyes. He held the weapon steady, as if he'd done it 100 times before, and maybe he had. The sun caught on the metal, sending a glint across her cheek. The weight of the street's attention pressed in, heavier than the summer heat. In the corner of her vision, she could see the school teacher, Anna, standing outside the post office with a stack of letters in her hands, her lips pressed tightly together. A few feet behind her, Luis the blacksmith had stepped out from his forge, his massive frame blocking part of the doorway, eyes narrowed as he watched. For a moment, it was as though the air had thickened. No one spoke, and the only sound was the faint creak of leather from the men's coats and the restless shift of hooves at the hitching posts. The tall one's jaw flexed as he studied her, perhaps expecting her to look away, to plead, to falter. She gave him none of that. Then from the far end of the boardwalk came the measured sound of boots on wood. Caleb O'Rourke emerged into view, his worn cavalry coat hanging open, the barrel of his Winchester resting easily against his shoulder. He didn't hurry. Each step was deliberate, the boards beneath him sounding out his approach like a slow drum beat. His eyes moved from one man to the next, unreadable, but his presence altered the air. The space seemed to shift subtly, the tension bending, not breaking, but no longer fully in the stranger's favor. Caleb came to a stop a few feet behind the man with the scattergun, his shadow falling across the edge of the barrel. He didn't speak, didn't raise the rifle to his shoulder. He only let the weight of his arrival settle into the scene, the kind of weight earned over years of standing one's ground. The man holding the scattergun glanced over his shoulder just briefly, enough for the barrel to waver by a fraction. The change was small, but it was enough. Evelyn moved with precision born from the countless hours Tom had once insisted upon training, not just her aim, but her awareness, her balance. She twisted her arms sharply against the grip holding her forearm, her boots shifting in the dust for leverage. At the same moment, she brought her other hand up to strike at the wrist of the man tugging on her badge. The motion jarred him, forcing his hand away. The tall man's revolver cleared its holster, but before he could level it, Caleb's rifle had angled just enough for the message to be clear. One twitch, and the air would crack with gunfire. Luis moved then, stepping off the boardwalk with a length of iron still in his hand from the forge, his bulk filling the narrow gap between Evelyn and the scattergun's barrel. The crowd's murmur rose, the first threads of noise in what had been silence. The strangers hesitated, their practiced unity fraying at the edges. Evelyn reached up and pressed the badge back into place on her coat, the gesture quiet but final. One by one, the weapons lowered, not far, not enough to be harmless, but enough to shift the current running through the street. She took their measure in that moment, her gaze meeting each man's in turn. There was no triumph there, only a steady recognition that this was not finished, not by a long shot. Still, the ground beneath her feet felt solid, anchored by the eyes now watching her, not with doubt, but with something closer to respect. Luis moved behind the strangers, and Caleb stepped forward just enough to close the gap. The three were turned slowly, deliberately, toward the direction of the jail. The sound of boots in the dust followed, the crowd parting in their path. The badge on her chest caught the sun again, and this time no one tried to take it. When they reached the office, she kept her pace even, the door swinging open ahead of them. Inside, the cool dimness wrapped around the moment, the lamplight catching the edges of metal as weapons were set aside and the clink of iron cuffs closed around wrists. Names were written into the ledger, along with every mark, every weapon, every coin they carried. The entries would stand as proof, a record of what had passed in full view of Red Hollow. Outside, the town's noise began to return, the thud of hammer on anvil, the murmur of voices, the slow clop of hooves. But something in that sound had changed, as if the rhythm of the place had shifted by a fraction, tilting in her favor. In the corner of the room, the badge glinted faintly in the light, a small, stubborn point of silver against the shadows. And though she knew the trouble was far from over, she also knew this much. The men who had come to take her star had failed, and the whole town had seen it. The fight for the law in Red Hollow was only beginning, but for the first time she felt the ground under her feet was hers to stand on. The air in Red Hollow carried a different weight in the days after the confrontation. It was as though the very boards of the sidewalks, the timbers of the storefronts, had absorbed what had happened in the middle of the street. People still spoke of it, sometimes in hushed tones, sometimes with a spark of pride, but the talk carried less doubt than before. Evelyn felt it in the way heads inclined toward her as she passed, in the eyes that no longer slid away quite so quickly. She knew it was only a small change, a shift in the surface tension rather than in the deep currents of opinion, but it was something, and she would take it. The three men from the street now sat in the cramped cells at the back of the sheriff's office. They had been silent for most of their confinement, speaking in low murmurs, only when they thought she was out of earshot. She knew they were still dangerous, even behind iron bars, and she kept the keys close at hand. Every so often, one of them would glance toward her with a look that promised unfinished business. It didn't matter. She'd had their weapons cataloged and stored, their names written into the ledger with every detail of their arrival in town, every coin and scrap of paper found on them. That record was as much a weapon as any revolver. The district judge's order authorizing a full inspection of Silas Broderick's mining operation sat in her desk drawer, its edges already creased from the number of times she had unfolded it to read and reread the words. It was a rare thing to have such authority granted without obstruction, and she knew better than to waste it. The town might see her wearing the badge, but the mine was where her real test lay. Before dawn on the day she chose, Evelyn walked to the livery, her boots quiet on the hard-packed earth. The sky was only beginning to pale, the stars still scattered across it. Caleb O'Rourke was already there, tightening the cinch on his bay mare. Luis arrived a few minutes later, a heavy coil of rope slung over one shoulder, his massive hands already dark with the soot of the forge. Two of the ranchers who had stood on the edge of the street during the confrontation volunteered to ride along, each of them steady with a rifle. Anna, the school teacher, had insisted on coming, not to fight, but to be there for the men and women they might bring out, someone to offer a calm face and a steady voice amid the chaos. They rode out in a loose formation, the horses' hooves muffled in the dust of the road. The land rose gradually toward the ridge where the mine sat, the trail cutting through scrub and patches of brittle grass. The sun had not yet cleared the hills and a chill still clung to the air. Evelyn kept her coat buttoned, the badge just visible at the edge of the lapel. The folded order was tucked inside, close to her chest, as though proximity could lend her resolve. When they reached the outskirts of the mining property, she reined in to take in the scene. The yard was still, the buildings outlined against the lightening sky. A pair of armed guards lounged near the gate, their attention more on the mugs of coffee in their hands than on the world beyond. She could hear the faint rattle of chains from somewhere beyond the main building, and the sound sent a slow heat through her veins. They moved quickly, splitting into two groups. Caleb and one of the ranchers approached the guards, using the element of surprise to disarm and bind them before a real alarm could be raised. Luis and the other rancher headed for the outbuildings, cutting off any route to the ridge. Evelyn dismounted and walked through the gate with the judge's order in one hand, her revolver in the other. The mine yard smelled of metal and sweat, a damp, suffocating odor that seemed to cling to the skin. Workers emerged from the barracks in ones and twos, their faces drawn and pale under layers of dust. Some looked at her with open confusion, others with the wary hope of people too long denied reason to believe in rescue. She handed the order to the foreman, a thick-set man with eyes like cold stone. He read the first line before tossing it back toward her, but she caught it in midair and held it up again. "This is the law," she said, her voice level. "You'll answer to it, or you'll answer in chains." The foreman didn't argue after that, though his mouth twisted in a way that promised his words would come later, in private. She set her team to work. Luis pried open the door to the main office, where they found ledgers with columns that didn't match the payrolls, receipts for equipment that never arrived, and lists of names that ended abruptly with no explanation. Anna moved among the workers, speaking to them softly, helping them gather what little they owned. It was behind the farthest of the low buildings that they found the worst of it, A hidden entrance to a narrow shaft had been boarded over from the outside, the wood fresh compared to the weathered walls around it. The boards came down under Luis's crowbar, and inside they found men chained at the ankles, the metal biting into raw skin. Their eyes blinked rapidly at the sudden light, and one by one they stumbled forward into the open air. The workers' stories came in fragments, some too choked with exhaustion to finish their sentences. They spoke of debts they could never repay, of being locked into night shifts that left them gasping for breath, of threats against their families if they tried to leave. Evelyn listened, each word winding tighter inside her until the coil was nearly unbearable. By midday, the operation was over. The guards had been secured, the evidence gathered, the workers freed. The foreman was in irons, his protest growing hoarse. They found Silas Broderick himself later that afternoon, attempting to leave town in a hired carriage, a satchel of documents under his arm. She intercepted him at the narrow bridge over the dry creek bed, forcing him to dismount and hand over the satchel. Inside were letters to the same 3 men she'd arrested days before. Instructions written in a hand as precise as it was damning. They brought Broderick back through Red Hollow, with no attempt to shield him from view. People stepped out of shops and doorways to watch, their expressions ranging from shock to something like satisfaction. The man who had owned so much of the town's labor now walked in irons, his boots leaving a trail of dust behind him. Back at the office, she locked him in the last open cell, then sat at her desk to begin the paperwork that would carry the case to the district court. It was slow work, every detail needing to be exact. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the lamplight threw long shadows across the floorboards. When she finally stepped outside, the night air felt clean in her lungs. The stars were sharp above the rooftops, and the town lay quiet in the kind of way that felt earned rather than imposed. She thought of Tom then, of the way he'd stood in this very street, believing in the law even when it cost him friends, comfort, and in the end, his life. The badge on her chest felt heavier than it had that morning, not from doubt, but from the weight of what it meant to carry it. The next weeks moved in a rhythm of depositions and preparation for the trials. The town watched her more closely than ever, some still wary, others openly grateful. When the day of the sheriff's election arrived, the air in Red Hollow seemed to hold its breath. The voting box sat on a table in the saloon, the ballots dropped in by hands that were calloused from work or smooth from ink and ledgers. She didn't stay to watch the count. She walked the street instead, letting the town see her moving as she always did, neither courting favor nor hiding from judgment. That night, the result was brought to her in a simple folded slip of paper. The margin was narrow, but it was enough. She was no longer acting sheriff. She was the sheriff of Red Hollow. Later, she walked out to the edge of town where the cemetery lay under the pale wash of moonlight. She stood before Tom's grave, the badge catching the faint glow, and let the silence speak between them. There was no triumph in her expression, only the steady resolve of someone who knew the fight would never truly be over. When she returned to the office, she set the badge on the desk beside her revolver and the keys to the cells. The map of the territory hung on the wall, the pins marking trails she would still need to ride, disputes she would have to settle, threats she would have to face. The law was never finished. It was work done day by day, choice by choice, with the understanding that every decision left a mark on the place and the people it touched. Outside, a young girl walked past, a wooden toy horse in her hand. She glanced in through the open door, and for a moment their eyes met. Evelyn saw the curiosity there, the unspoken question about what a sheriff could be. She straightened in her chair, the badge gleaming faintly in the lamplight, and let the answer speak for itself. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our next video for another powerful journey and explore our other videos for more stories like this one. And please, share this video with someone who needs to hear it.